So thank you for having me today. I also am new to this community. I am Vanessa Sochat. As I was introduced, I'm a computer scientist / research software engineer at Lawrence Livermore National Lab. And today I'm here to give you kind of a different kind of talk. I'm going to tell you the story of the research software engineer movement. So our talk's going to have 5 parts today. We're going to first talk about that history itself, what the heck's been going on in the past decade. Then we're going to kind of step back and be like, hold on, what is a research software engineer? Because I would suspect some folks in this discussion haven't even heard that term. Then we're going to talk about problems that still remain. Most importantly, how you can help. And then what do we want for the future? So let's get started. Once upon a time, there was a thriving savanna filled with researchers, including planetary scientists. And the rule of the land was publish or perish, because you could be the most successful PI, the strongest of the savanna, but you still had the weight of the world on your shoulders. And the reason was because not only did you need to be an expert in your domain science, you also needed to have mad skills as a software engineer, because software played such an important part in research. So if you have been around this past decade or even now, you may have noticed that a dark cloud moved over the savanna. And the reason was because it was just too much for one person to handle that kind of burden. But thankfully, there are wise elders that have been looking out for us, such as at 2010 at the International Conference on Global Software Engineering. They did this empirical study of tool support and highly distributed research projects. And they said, we think there's this thing called research software engineering. And no, it's not a single proof of person concept or a prototype. It is this thing for highly distributed collaborative projects. And so arguably, this was the first utterance of the term research software engineering that I could find acknowledged in a publication. And this was really the dawn of a new era, because although computing had been used in research for decades, as we know, this was the first time that it was really acknowledged. So we continue our story, and it was a beautiful sunny day in March of 2012, and a small group met at the Queen's College, Oxford. There it is. It's a very beautiful building. I'm terribly uncultured, so I've never been there. And they had this one question on their mind: why is there no career for software developers in academia? And so they had discussion, and as you do after a meeting, you create a Google group and you kind of summarize what you learned. And they said, here are the 5 most important things that we learned. 1, we need a label for this new profession. Let's call it research software engineer. And I don't know if they had read that paper back from 2010 and they had read about research software engineering, or they came up with it then. But this is really the first time that someone gave that as a title, as a role for a person. They also said, we're going to need an institution or professional body, a little foreshadowing of things to come. We need certification, training, education, and most importantly, we need recognition by the larger academic community. And so in 2012, this is arguably at this conference, CW12, when the movement really started to take off in the UK. And people at the time, it was really awesome, because they were looking around, they're like, maybe I'm a research software engineer. I've been a research developer 2.5 for 3 years, but like this role really jives with what I do. And so they continued to think and to talk about it in digital research in 2012. They wrote this paper, The Research Software Engineer, and this went beyond sort of the basics, and it really got into talking about the career. They said, there are software developers in the commercial industry. Why are we lagging so far behind? Why is it that our tools are like fragile and not sustainable beyond like the funding of a project? Why is it that we don't have training, that sort of what we do is like ad hoc? And do institutions realize the opportunity cost of not acknowledging our community? And so they wanted to talk about it more. So this led to the first UK RC workshop. And I found the Google sheet online that had the schedule. And this was really interesting to look at, because a lot of the things that they cared about then, we still really care about now. For example, cloud versus HPC. Have you ever heard people get into an argument about that? Collaboration, how do we share our code? What are the best practices? Sustainability, what are we going to do with that old Fortran code from 2 decades ago? And finally, a lot of issues around community, culture, and the RC role, and these are still heavily discussed to this day. Alrighty, so 2013, this was the first UK RSE workshop. And soon after that, as I foreshadowed earlier, they created the Society of Research Software Engineering. This is a site at societyrc.org if you've never been there. This was in 2014. So look at all the stuff that has happened in just a couple of years. So what comes after society? Well, groups, of course, but as Aragorn here is giving us, one does not simply start an RSE group. It is incredibly challenging. Like, you have to think about funding. Where's the group going to sit? How are you going to hire people? How the heck is it sustainable? Is it a service group? Is it more of a research group or a lab? It's a hard thing. But a lot of people in the UK decided to take on that challenge. So the first to create a group was James Hetherington at the University College of London, shortly followed by Robert Haynes at the University of Manchester, Mike Croucher and Paul Richmond at the University of Sheffield, Christopher Woods at the University of Bristol, and finally Simon Hetrick and Job Robinson, not pictured, I couldn't find his picture, at the University of Southampton. Alrighty, so things are really taking off in 2015. By 2015, we have all of these groups that are popping up around the UK. And so naturally, they kind of want to check bases with each other, like, hey, how are you doing? Or what's working for you? What's not working? So they created these RSE leaders meetings, and they just meet a couple times a year to do exactly that. So that was 2015. That led to the establishment of the RSE leaders. What about the rest of the world? Like, is it only the case that research software engineers are in the UK? And their home country. And in 2016, they created the first global conference for research software engineers in September. So that was in 2016. That's also sort of a very important date, because shortly after that, if we kind of nudge our timeline down a little bit, there were other societies established in other countries, so Germany and RSE Australia and New Zealand. And obviously then there's sort of local leaders workshops developed into an international leaders workshop. So they had people obviously from the UK, but also the United States, and then as far as New Zealand. And finally, if you look down here in the bottom right, finally my country, the United States, got on board, and the United States Research Software Engineer Association was established in 2019, which is a lot more recent than the other ones. And by today, 2022, there are over 30 groups in the UK. There are groups in other countries. I cannot put them all on this silly little timeline slide. What I can do is show you some of the logos and representation. And I think what this reflects is how good of a job we've done at growing as a community. Here you just see that we have this common branding, the colors, even sometimes the fonts. But what we also have is we have a common set of events, and we really do well working together. And that doesn't always happen, but it happened in this case. Alrighty, so if I had to kind of summarize the RSE movement, I'd say, okay, 2010, that's when someone first said research software engineering. 2012, that's when the movement took off in the UK. 2016, it went global, and it's just been going crazy and awesome ever since. Alrighty, so that's a review of the RSE movement. Again, this is like a high-level story. I recommend that you search on like Google or YouTube for stories from some of these group leaders, because they all have a really interesting story. And I'll put a little ping out there. USRSE just wrote up a document that describes our story since, pretty recent 2019. So check that one out too. So now let's go into what is a research software engineer, because I know, Vanessa, you haven't told me what is an RSE. I will. So if you went to any of these sort of group leaders talks in the last decade, they would have showed you this slide. They would have said, a research software engineer is someone that exists on this continuum between software engineering and research, and maybe you're here and maybe you're here. And like, the problem with this definition is I kind of looked at it and I scratched my head and I was like, well, okay, I get it. I think also that an RSE is like between programmer and researcher, but the problem as I saw it was that you also see RSEs that are web developers, or they do system administration. Maybe there's some kind of actual scientist or farmer. They're also still students. I would consider myself an RSE when I was still a student. They do user support. Maybe they work in a library, or they're a manager, or they're data science. So the problem with this definition is that it's extremely limited. And someone might look at this and be like, yeah, I really was driving with this, but I guess I'm not an RSE. So I had this question in 2019, I was seeing people giving these talks in Power, telling this very limited story of what an RSE is. And I was like, how do we hear RSE stories? Like, how do we actually get across this message that we are such a diverse community? And first I made a YouTube video. I wrote a story called The Story of the Research Software Engineer, the little hammer that could, and that was fun and cute and all, but like, how far is a YouTube video gonna get? But then I woke up one morning in September and I was like, I know what I need to do. I'm gonna start a podcast. This is like the worst idea. You can't really tell. I'm sort of introverted, and like regularly meeting with people and talking to them is like not really my thing, but I knew it was so important to do. So I decided to do it. And even the next year, my co-host, my ultimate co-host, Peter Schmidt from the UK said, hey, Vanessa, I would love to help you out and also be a host. And Peter joined the podcast for about a year, and it was awesome. Another total attestation to how well we work together and sort of the growth of our community. Peter went on to start his own podcast called Code for Thought, which is super cool because now we have 2 podcasts and we are just growing. Speaking of growth, I wanted to quickly show you this plot just to kind of give you a sense of like the numbers of people that are out there that are interested in our community. So you can see where it was established in 2019, it was tiny. And the growth since then has just been like, well, pretty linear if you ask me. And it's really, we're almost at 1,000 people, it looks like. Alrighty, so what the heck do RSEs do? You know, I've kind of given you a hint, but this is a hard question to answer. So one thing we're doing in the education and training working group of USRC is we're trying to like make like a list of skills and categories of stuff that RSEs do. And you can see the top level categories. It ranges from software development to data, people related, community. And I'm not gonna like expand out this list, but I will tell you there's like 120 things in it. And so I know what you're thinking. You're like, oh my God, Vanessa, that's like too many things for one person to do. And I agree. We're not saying that every RSE does all of these things, but it's just that we've seen that RSEs tend to do some of the things in the list, like a subset of things. And so I kind of wanted to step back, you know, and say, okay, well, there must be some better way to describe it than to like give someone this chunker list and be like, there you go, it's like the whole thing. So I wanted to think about what are the different types of RSEs. So the first one is service-oriented. So a service-oriented RSE is maybe sitting within a lab or group such as research computing, and they're providing a service for researchers. So someone comes to them and be like, oh, I need to optimize the script, or we need to have this, you know, this web application built. Let's like make this happen. A development-oriented RSE is someone that's probably sort of embedded in a community, maybe very familiar with a domain science, and they're working on core software for that community. And it's less of a service approach. It's more like we are working on this together. I am part of your community. Research-oriented is something that I didn't really encounter until I was at a national lab. And this is really where you're working on sort of like fundamental models or introspection around software, maybe like a solver, for example, for a package manager. So now that we sort of have these like areas, I also wanted to think about like, well, what are kind of like the flavors of research software engineer? And again, this is a sort of arbitrary list that I came up with. But if I look around and I had to like put people in categories, I'd say that you see RSEs that are sort of along these lines. Alrighty, so that is probably not a great summary of what is an RSE, but hopefully it gives you a flavor. Now let's go into what problem still remains. I'm going to talk about the problems that I think are most important. So if any of you noticed at the beginning of this talk, I introduced myself as a computer scientist / research software engineer. This was the fib. This was a little misleading because my title is actually just computer scientist, and the other one I just sort of penned on there. And this is actually a problem in our community. If I go back and I just look at my titles, I've always had the title that's like research assistant, technician 2, information. Like I've never had a title that's like, yes, she's working on research software. And actually they did a study in the UK where they looked at 10,000 job advertisements. Of those 10,000, they found 400 that were sort of RSE related. And get this, 194, almost 200 or half of them had different job titles. So this is just an attestation to like, there are people out there doing research software engineering, but they are not united by a title. And this is sort of the first problem that I want to bring up. There isn't recognition or formal structure for the role. The next thing has to do with sort of how people get into this role. So let's say you graduate from college and you're like, yeah, I want to go to graduate school. So you'd go to graduate school. And then you kind of look at your future career path and you're like, okay, well, I can become a postdoc and then I'm going to become an assistant professor. And then maybe if I'm in like the 2 to 3% of like people that are just really, really lucky, I'll become a principal investigator. But like, wait a minute, what if like you don't want that at all? What if you go to graduate school and you're like, my God, I love writing code and this is great. And I'm looking at that career path in front of me that looks terrible. I want to like make money and I want job security. And then you feel like this. You feel like one of these things that doesn't fit. There's no traditional path in academia for you. You have to like pave your own path, so to speak. So what if instead of becoming a research associate too, and then getting stuck there and like dying, there was a career path that you could become a research software engineer. And so I'm not saying that graduate school is required for becoming an RSE. This is just an example because there are people that, come straight out of college or come from different careers. But this is just one example that highlights this fact that there isn't training or a stable career path. Most people you talk to are going to tell you some like custom crafted, like artisanal, like avocado toast story about how they got there. Alrighty, so those I think personally are the two major problems that remain. Now let's get to the most important part of the talk. How can you help? So I think there's a couple of ways you can help. Let's start with like the easy ones first. The first way is you can engage with your local research software community. So this means like checking out the website, seeing what kind of events are there. Is there anything that you're interested in? Maybe you want to like talk to people. So for example, there's a US RSC Slack. There's also a UK Slack. We tend to everyone kind of joins both of them because we like having more friends. You can also, I think it's really helpful if you're having like a hard time getting like, what is an actual example of an RSC role? Take a look at job boards. Loading. And there's a really good reflection of like what people are actually looking for there. On that Twitter place, I recommend that you follow your favorite association or person and get a sense of what's going on with the community. Alrighty, so another easy way that you can help is to find RSCs at your institution and talk to them. Be like, hey, how's it going? What do you do for your role? How do you feel about it? How's your job security? It's amazing just what someone talking to someone else and saying like, hey, I'm interested in what you're doing and I care what that can do for mental health. Finally, well, not finally, but so one problem that our community still faces is that RSCs are sort of valued in this traditional academic sense based on publications. But historically, someone that may be more involved with research software doesn't always get on the publication. They get in like acknowledgements or something like that. If someone is an RSC that you work with, put them on your papers. If, for example, the paper doesn't really go into the software because it's more about the science part, encourage them to publish in a software journal, such as the Journal of Open Source Software. It takes like under an hour to write a paper for software that already has documentation and that sort of thing. And so let's say you're like really excited about this and you want to help with all the things. What are more involved ways that you can help? Well, the first one is to talk to people with influence. So if you're having, for example, a meeting with a department head, be like, hey, have you heard of this RSC thing? Research software is super important for what we're doing. Are we at this institution doing anything about that? You can also take the time to write your software needs and how you'll use an RSC in your proposal. So set aside funding for software. This kind of thing is going to help to become more of a part of like this traditional academic fabric where they really aren't a part yet. And I'm not saying to start a group. I know it'd be super hard to start a group, but look around you and be like, if someone were to start a group around me, like who would that be? What could it look like? It's definitely an interesting question to ask because there's like many ways to do it. You could also, for example, if you're in like a small lab and you really would like to have an RSC, but you just don't have the funding, one thing that I've seen works really well is for like a bunch of people from a department to get together and to pool their funds and then to hire the first RSC and then to like prove that they're useful and then grow from there. Alrighty, so for those in the audience that are skeptical, I'm gonna give you a different kind of motivation. What happens if you don't? Well, If you have kind of bad software, you might get papers rejected, which sucks, especially if that's like the meat of your career. And this happens, so this is like an extreme example, but this one scientist had 5 retractions, like one's bad enough, right? 5 retractions because of bad software. On the flip side, if you have good software, you just might get more papers accepted. Just want to throw that out there. And you might also, because of the papers thing, you're going to have slower career progression. And maybe you're like a scientist sloth and you're like, this is fine, I'm good, but it shouldn't be fine. And if you're one of those labs that's like, we use our homegrown lab scripts, like out in the backyard with the avocados, like these kind of scripts are really hard to extend, and people aren't going to want to use your code, your spaghetti code. So, your work's not going to easily be extended. If you're also one of these people that's like, I don't want to share my code, nope, you're going to have a hard time finding collaborators and getting funding, because the culture of sharing code, being open, for reproducibility, all of that is like the way the community has been moving. Oh, but Vanessa, I don't need any help. I got things covered. Okay. Here are some signs in the wild that you need an RSC. So first, you don't have a strategy for storing or moving data. Just throw it in Scratch, John, along with all the other data sets lost and forgotten. You don't share any of your code on GitHub. You are afraid of getting scooped. You want to just like stay on your little private island and talk to Wilson. You get feedback in a paper that methods aren't clear and you can't remember how you did it. Someone tries your software and they struggle. You go back and forth for like a week trying to like debug their error messages, and you're like, why is this my life? You don't have a plan for testing, portability, or validation. Yeah, John, the plan is there's no plan. Let's just like figure it out as we go. Your code isn't optimized. It's really, really slow. This is actually a really cool example that happened, I think January earlier in the year. So basically they had this script that took 10 days to run. So imagine like starting your script and like going on vacation and being like, yeah, it'll be done when we get back. They got it down to 34 seconds. So that is just one example of like what an RSE can do. To the future. So the first thing that we want is a stable job not funded by soft money. So I literally left my last job because I would lie there at night being like, oh my God, is my role going to be a thing next year? I just want job stability, job security. Formal training or certification, we want some kind of graduate program concentration. It shouldn't be so ad hoc. There should be a clearly defined set of like courses or program or something that you can take to become an RSE. And we really want to continue with this like collaborative fabric. Imagine if there were RSEs across universities and institutions, we could be able to kind of talk to each other, know what other people are working on, stretch out our hands, and like better do the work that we do, which leads to better research. We want this goes without saying, we want competitive salaries and career advancement. It shouldn't be the case that you like go in your role and then you're just like stuck there. We also, I think this is important since I've joined a national lab. National labs really set the example for a lot of things. So I think national labs really need to kind of sign on and be a big part of this movement. And I think it's going to naturally follow that when, research software engineering communities are thriving, that's going to really help open source as well. And, DEI as well, like we are a technical community. We still suffer from these issues. So we also want to kind of focus on efforts that help us with diversity, equity, and inclusion. And finally, y'all, like, I don't want to publish or perish. Like, I'm a software engineer and I think I write good code, and I'm just really tired of having to like artificially write papers to prove my value. So imagine a future where we're in the savannah together and the RSCs can remove this burden from the researchers, and we can live happily ever after doing awesome science. So if there's one thing that you ask yourself or you take away from this talk, given that better software will help your research, how do you want to help? That's all I got. I am VSoc on Twitter and GitHub. There's a little acknowledgement for the graphics, and this is the slide I have to show by my employer, disclaimer, blah, blah, blah. Are there any questions?